the people of South Africa, declare for all our country and the world to know that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of all the people. That our people have been robbed of their birthright to land, liberty, and peace by a form of government founded on injustice and inequality. That our country will never be prosperous or free until all our people live in a brotherhood, enjoying equal rights and equal opportunities. That only a democratic state, based on the will of all the people, can secure to all their birthrights without distinction of color, race, sex, or beliefs. And therefore, we the people of South Africa, black and white together, equals countrymen and brothers, adopt this Freedom Charter, and we pledge ourselves to strive together, sparing neither strength nor courage, until the democratic changes set out here have been won. The doors of learning and culture shall be opened. The government shall discover, develop, and encourage national talent for the enhancement of our cultural life. There shall be houses, security, and comfort. All people shall have the right to live where they choose, to be decently housed, and to bring up their families in comfort and security. There shall be peace and friendship. South Africa shall be a fully independent state which respects the rights and sovereignty of nations. Let all who love their people and their country say now, as we say here, these freedoms we shall fight for side by side throughout our lives until we have won our liberty. The Freedom Charter is a very significant document in our struggle, in that it was not imposed on the people by a few office bearers of any organization, but it was a document which was drawn by the people themselves, and it embodies the aspirations of the people themselves. The principles which we fought for in 1976 and which we're still fighting for now. If we look back the history of our struggle and see where they originated, we can see clearly that they originated also in the Freedom Charter, because the Freedom Charter rejects the Bantustans, though at the time they were not actually in practice. It talks about freedom of education, housing, freedom to work, to stay where you like, and all these ideas were originated in the Freedom Charter, but are now being carried on by people who may consciously or not consciously be aware that they are taking those ideas from the Freedom Charter.
It's been 65 years since the adoption of the Freedom Charter in Kliptown. The Charter was the statement of the core principles of the South African Congress Alliance, consisting of the African National Congress and its allies, the South African Indians Congress, the South African Congress of Democrats, and the Coloured People's Congress. It is characterized by its opening demand that the people shall govern. The document is notable for its demand and its commitment to a non-racial South Africa, and this remains the platform of how this country is to be governed. A warm welcome to all our viewers across the continent. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Audrey Chimwanda, and this is Galaxy Prime. We're live on channel 500 on Galaxy Universal Network. Our Facebook page is also live. Our social media platforms are there for you to please engage with us. Would be happy to hear what you have to say with regards to this a very important and very special day. Joining me in studio to unpack what this day means is the first Deputy General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, Mr. Solly Mapaila. Thank you for honoring our invitation.
Thank you very much, Audrey, and afternoon to our viewers.
Right, now just starting off, People say that it is critical to protect this part of our history. Just a couple of days ago, or more than a couple of days ago, we were celebrating the Youth Day. And how that is important. How do we engage the youth to keep them interested to take up the modern struggle in the same way that it happened before? You know, our mothers and fathers were able to do that and still be able to encompass what the Freedom Charter means.
Yeah, firstly to appreciate that this day for us in the liberation movement is practically our actual Freedom Day. It's the day in which our people decided to leave the shackles of apartheid and oppression, racist oppression, and to free themselves and to declare to themselves and the rest of the world what they want South Africa to be like. As we celebrate many other days, including our April 27 as the Freedom Day, we never forget that this was a very important day that in the liberation movement was actually a holiday. It was a day in which we were able to reflect on the future of South Africa that will be free from exploitation, prosperous, non-racial, non-sexist, united and democratic. And therefore, what is contained in the Freedom Charter remains the principal struggles of the daily challenges facing our people today. And if we achieve what is in the Freedom Charter, there will be no single South African who can declare that they are poor or discriminated against. So meaning that the Freedom Charter, if you like, is the platform on which we can have a truly equal South Africa without any form of exploitation and oppression. And therefore, it remains a lodestar that all our young people and the people as a whole should follow what is contained in the Freedom Charter as a principal platform on which to build policies and other things. Of course, taking into account several developments, but whatever is contained there, whether it's the economic clause, whether it's the social clause, all of that actually guarantees the well-being of all South Africans.
Well, some may argue to say, you know, the Charter may have been inspiring in the dark days of apartheid, and it was a wish list of a certain time and place back then that may not be necessarily relevant this day and age. How would you respond to that?
There's no section of the Charter that is not inspiring today. They remain all inspiring. If you take, let's take the first clause, the people shall govern. We're struggling with a democracy that on its own is unresponsive to the needs of the people. And the concept of the people shall govern as encapsulated in the Freedom Charter, one may say, or expand on it to say, it did not necessarily mean only representative democracy. It could have meant many other forms of democracies that can still be explored. In the country, for instance, we've seen how the Constitutional Court just ruled regarding our electoral system. Correct. And called for reforms in that particular space. What it also means is that at the local government level, for instance, the people should participate in the decisions about local economy as well as the local budget of their municipalities. So it should not just be representatives coming together and decide that this is how the budget is going to be and so forth and so forth. Maybe do something that is important, the balancing of books, but, and still have a majority of people living in poverty. So there's no poverty in the Freedom Charter. There's prosperity and wealth that is shared amongst all the people.
What I picked up from you, I suppose, when you started this conversation is to say when the liberation movement ascended to this negotiated political power, they seem to now have abandoned all the principles and values that encompass the Freedom Charter in the way that we see people living now, the majority of the people.
They have not. They have not. I think in all the charters you can look into, I mean all the 10 clauses of the charter, you can look into every clause and see that government has based its policy on those clauses. But it has not achieved fully all the elements of the clause. For instance, what could have been achieved, let's say the section that deals with justice. We declare that all shall be equal before the law. But under capitalism, equality before the law means something else. A poor person in the squatter camps and a rich fellow in Sandton their equality before the law is not the same. The other one can take good money, put it on the table, and be outside of jail. The other one can't pay, he can't post even bail. So the clause remains important, but they've not been achieved fully. But we've transformed the law that doesn't have to look into the color of your skin. But the law, we've not transformed the class basis of inequality, which is the fundamental form of inequality. That's why we in the communists, if you look into your introduction, for instance, you didn't mention that the allies of the ANC that adopted the Freedom Charter was the Communist Party, because at the time the Communist Party was already banned by the apartheid regime through the Suppression of Communism Act. Its members were there. Some of them read the clause. In fact, the man that summarized the 10th clause of the Freedom Charter, Rusty Bernstein, was a Central Committee member of the Communist Party, a senior leader of the Communist Party. That's why at some point the apartheid regime even tried to say this was a communist document, which was a people's document, because they canvassed the rest of society. So it remains fundamentally important, but achieving those objectives, like in many other African countries where we've gained independence and we have the flag, we have the national anthem, we have the constitution, and the people still live in poverty. Some section of the people still live in poverty, but we have the freedoms to move up and down and so forth. So,
but this is the thing that I always refer to, you know, with the political power that the Revolutionary Party managed to then get. They have the machinery to be able to change people's lives. What is stopping them from doing that?
Yes, the fundamental problem is the control of the political and economic machinery. Normally, we control the political machinery, have the liberty to set out the laws and so forth, but don't control the economy. In our theory of Marxism, we normally say that one of the first tasks of a successful revolution is the dismantling of the oppressive machinery of the enemy. So in our case, we used a different variation of the concept of dialectics, that in order to move forward, you don't have to destroy everything. For instance, we occupied the Union Building, which was occupied by the apartheid government, but we occupied the Union Building to put a democratic document and to have a democratic state. We didn't have to destroy the Union Building because it was built by the Boers. So it is that combination. But of course, what is fundamental is that unless we control the economy, we will not be able to truly free the people, because the capitalist economy, it's not meant for the well-being of all. They normally even characterize it as it's a system of opportunity. Those who are opportunists or those who are lucky, they will be there, have the best opportunities. It doesn't give us a standard platform to have equal access to anything. Right. So it is in that regard that the fundamental problem today on the African continent, in fact this is an extremely worrying factor, is the fact that we don't have socialist example in government on the African continent. We have sporadic governments. For instance, Libya had some deeper elements of socialism in Libya. Eritrea currently is the one that is the closest to socialism, but is completely isolated and actually denigrated by the world powers, because they don't want that example to reach out to the rest of the continent to see the levels of equality amongst the people. When you go to places like Eritrea, how the people live, it's something you feel it. That's actually this is what we've been fighting for, but it's not there across the African countries. Because it's been isolated, because there, the system, the way it works, it's not your full throttle capitalist system. Unlike here you can have basically the most industrialized country on the African continent. In fact, had Nigeria not rebased its economy, we could still say South Africa remains the biggest economy on the African continent. In fact, in some instances, some of the economies, including if we were to take an appropriate industrial economy of Nigeria as the biggest economy on the continent, is not comparable to the economy of Gauteng as a province of South Africa, industrially. So if you have that kind of a capacity of a state, which has about 30% of the GDP of the continent, and yet its citizens live in squatter camps, live in poverty, what is the problem? The problem is in the social distribution of wealth of that particular society. Right. Because the basis of social production, it's not based on social needs. It's based on profit maximization. That's why you have billionaires and so forth and so forth. That's the measurement of how well off you are. Right. Yes, whereas being well off shouldn't, is actually there in the Freedom Charter. It shows how to be a well-off individual without being poor. And you don't have to have billions not to be poor.
I want to read this excerpt from June 2017 from Cyril Ramaphosa. He was then the deputy president. I wanted to kind of give us give us the context of the conversation I want us to have. He said, the Freedom Charter captures perfectly the intent and to some extent the content of radical economic transformation. It was the Congress of the People that representatives of the people of this country gathered to declare that the people shall share in the country's wealth. The ANC's program of radical economic transformation has its roots in the Freedom Charter. Is this just lip service at this point? I mean, you're an alliance partner. What conversations are you having with the ruling party?
Well, we are having all those conversations. The deeper conversation, it's how to control what we call the means of production, how to control the economy, if you like, the factories. And the fundamental platform of the South Africa's capitalism, which is financial capitalism, because South Africa, or capitalism worldwide, has deeply financialized. So even South Africa's capitalist system has deeply financialized. So the financial institutions are the hardcore capitalist institutions that are controlling the mining industry and other industries, because they give them the money, and on that basis they also sometimes give themselves shares in those industries together. Basically, the finance industries, the banks and the insurance companies, they all work together as one single grouping. We don't have a control of the finance sector. That's why as a Communist Party we continue to fight to make sure that we establish as many as possible of public finance institutions, because without that you will continue to rely on finance capital to fund your economy. And when they do so, they charge you. For instance, as a very nasty example, we've got what we call Development Finance Institutions of South Africa, DBSA, IDC, Industrial Development Corporation. They don't have a direct relationship with the South African Reserve Bank to get money. But these are state development finance institutions of the state. They go through commercial banks to get money, which I can go and borrow as an entrepreneur to develop whatever industry that I want to develop. So we need public sector banks or finance institutions. Germany, as an example, for instance, comes out of the Second World War and built massive economy based on public banking. The same as Japan. And they all went on to become, Germany is the biggest economy in Europe today. Japan became at the time the second biggest economy after the US. It's now overtaken by China. But all of that, they built their economy on the basis of money creation through public banking system. So we don't have that. So we go and rely on the public banks, for instance. We privatize almost everything. One big debate we're engaging now in our alliance, for instance, during COVID-19, students have to go back to universities, and it comes out they don't have instruments. We try and organize instruments, then they must have airtime. The government goes to negotiate with the telecommunications companies for airtime. Why, when we control the spectrum? The spectrum should belong to us. So when we give allocation of spectrum to telecommunication companies, whether it's Vodacom, MTN, whatever, we should be able to insist in that, for instance, products for social development. How, for instance, do they charge us data fees or spectrum fees just to roll out public education? It's nonsensical. So that is why at the core of the problem is the capitalist system, because it's not meant for the majority, it's meant for a few.
We're going to take a very short break, and please do join in the conversation. It's not just here in studio, you're at home. Are welcome to go onto our social media platforms and give us your comments and your experience of how far we've come 65 years later from since the adoption of the Freedom Charter. Would love to hear from you. We're going to take a very short break. When we come back, I want us to talk about something that's perhaps a bit more personal to you, your experience of being a fighter in your youth days, if I can put it that way, your days in exile. I think that is something that we'd like to talk about as well. What precipitated for you to make that decision. Do stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
The coronavirus outbreak.
Experience the extraordinary.
Tremendous waste and tremendous fraud. Mexico is, in fact, you will soon find out.
It is a day to celebrate.
We don't approve at all what's going on.
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily unusual.
Challenge your ordinary.
Not only the government, the municipality here has had no plan.
Experience the extraordinary with StarSat.